"Don't go in that house," the homeless boy shouted, but Big Shaq stepped closer. What was inside didn't growl, didn't scream. It remembered. Walls held names that were erased. The floor hid stories no one dared tell. And when Big Shaq discovered the truth, he didn't just freeze, he realized the house was never empty. It was silent. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. It started like any ordinary day. The sun hung politely above Cedar Valley, spilling warm light onto trimmed hedges, clean sidewalks and painted porches. Shaquille O'Neal, or Big Shaq, as most knew him, had just wrapped a morning mentorship session at the youth center. His gait was easy, confident, shoulders broad, steps slow and thoughtful. He wasn't in a rush. He rarely was. But that afternoon he chose a different way home. Not out of habit, out of instinct. There was a path behind the shuttered library, one rarely spoken of. The kind of route people remember when they need to forget something. Overgrown grass whispered around cracked stone. The air there was still, a bit too still for spring. A fence broken at one end opened into the oldest part of town, where sunlight touched things but warmth rarely stayed. Most people avoided it. Shaq didn't. Maybe it was curiosity. Maybe it was something deeper. Maybe it was that subtle voice inside a man who's seen too much to ignore a place everyone else pretends doesn't exist. He stepped through the gap in the fence, the hush swallowing the sound of his sneakers on dirt. The neighborhood on the other side felt like a memory that didn't want to be remembered. Crooked porches, windows boarded with warped plywood, and signs so old the paint had given up. And yet it wasn't abandoned. Not completely. Mailboxes still stood like soldiers. Lawns were cut just enough. The signs of life were faint, but deliberate. It felt like a stage after the audience left but before the curtain dropped. Then he saw the boy, standing barefoot at the edge of a dried-up lawn, maybe 10 years old. Thin but not ragged, too clean for the word homeless, but too wild in the eyes to belong anywhere safe. His hair was matted into uneven patches, and his shirt clung to him like it hadn't been washed in days. But it wasn't his appearance that made Shaq pause. It was the way the boy stared at a house just down the block. Not with curiosity, with fear. Shaq followed his gaze. The house sat crookedly behind a leaning iron gate. Paint peeled in long, curling strips. 2 upstairs windows were sealed from the inside with what looked like black trash bags. The porch sagged left, and one shutter swung gently, though there was no breeze. Still, Shaq moved forward. That's when the boy shouted, "Don't go in that house." It wasn't a plea. It was a command, sharp, desperate, like the warning of someone who had seen the price of being ignored. But by the time Shaq turned around, the boy was gone, vanished, without even the sound of retreating feet. He stared at the empty patch of sidewalk where the kid had stood. Not a soul in sight, just the slight sway of that lone shutter on the house ahead. Shaq wasn't a man given to superstition. He believed in patterns, in signs, in instincts earned through life lived in the open. But something about that house gripped him. Not like a threat, like a question. He stepped forward, eyes scanning the porch. The stairs looked half-rotted, but passable. No smell of rot, no graffiti, just neglect that felt intentional, like something preserved rather than abandoned. At the edge of the porch, a wind chime made of spoons clinked together, though there was no wind. A motion sensor light flickered briefly above the door, then blinked out again. It was daytime. He reminded himself of that. This wasn't some haunted hour. And yet, the house breathed like it knew it had been noticed. Shaq looked back down the street. Nothing. Not even a curtain twitch. The shortcut was known for its silence. Not just of voices, but of stories. Nobody asked what had happened here. Nobody offered memories. He took one more step toward the porch, then stopped. There, sticking out of the rusted mailbox, was a faded white envelope. His name wasn't on it, but someone else's was. Lucille, his mother's name. Scrawled in looping black ink, half faded from the sun. The house had just changed everything. His chest tightened in the way it did, when past and present overlapped. Lucille had never lived in this neighborhood. Never even spoken of it. But she had once told him, some houses aren't homes. They're graves people keep living in.
Was this one of them?
He didn't touch the envelope. Not yet. Instead, he stepped back from the porch. Just a few paces. Enough to feel the ground under his feet again. Enough to look at the house with new eyes. There was no wind. No voices.
No boy.
Just the sun, pressing down hard, as if it too wanted to know what lived behind those boarded windows. Shaq exhaled slowly. He wouldn't go in today, but he would come back, because some doors don't stay closed forever, especially the ones that never should have been in the first place. Shaq returned the next day, not out of curiosity, but because something inside him refused to let the image go. The barefoot boy, the envelope, the house that felt too still. His mind had turned the warning over all night. But it wasn't the boy's voice that haunted him. It was the name. Lucille. The morning was crisp, sunlight cutting across Cedar Valley in angled streaks. Even in its forgotten corner, the street didn't look completely dead, the kind of neighborhood where decay and denial held hands. Things didn't rot, they just quietly faded. And yet the house on Weller Street hadn't faded. It was waiting. Shaq walked slowly this time, not hesitant, alert, observing. And the closer he came, the more the details betrayed the illusion of abandonment. The first thing he noticed was the grass. Not neat, but not wild either. Clipped just enough to not attract code enforcement. The hedges had been trimmed recently. Sloppily, but deliberately. A pile of green clippings sat bunched near the front step. Whoever did it didn't want the house to look cared for, just enough to be left alone. Then there were the tire tracks. Deep, dry, fresh. The kind that hadn't been softened by rain or time. Shaq crouched slightly, fingers brushing the edge of one. The tread pattern was wide. SUV, maybe a heavy truck. It curved around the gravel shoulder like someone had backed in, not just passed through. Someone had been here. Recently, Shaq stood back up, eyes rising to the porch again. The envelope was still there, white, curled at the corners. His mother's name, Lucille, written in thick looping script. The ink hadn't bled. No rain had touched it. No wind had carried it away. He climbed the porch steps, each board groaning with age, but not giving way. Midway up, a breeze passed, not from ahead, but behind, and the wind chime above the door clinked once. Just one. Then silence. The door remained shut, the windows still dark and veiled, but the air had shifted. Not colder, closer. Shaq reached for the envelope, lifting it gently, like it might crumble under his fingers. But it didn't. The paper was thick, too heavy for modern mailing stock. Inside was something flat, a photo maybe, or a folded note. He didn't open it right away. Instead, he stepped off the porch and stood in the yard, facing the house with the envelope in hand. And that's when he saw it. The front door frame had been repainted. Not well, just around the edges. The brushstrokes were uneven, but fresh. A pale cream that didn't match the faded blue of the siding. Someone had tried to cover up marks, scratches maybe, old symbols, or name. Not all scars are on the skin. Some live in architecture. Shaq looked down the street again. Still empty. Still no boy. Still no movement behind the cracked blinds of the nearby houses. The quiet here wasn't peaceful. It was strategic. He opened the envelope. Inside was a single, aged photograph. Black and white. A woman, young, proud, standing on a porch that looked achingly familiar. Lucille, younger than Shaq had ever seen her, and behind her, barely visible, was the house. This house. His mother had been here, not visited, lived here. He stared at the photo, heart tightening, breath thinning. Why had she never told him? Why had her name vanished from every document he knew? No family records placed her in this part of town. No conversations ever lingered on Weller Street. Lucille was proud. Precise. She remembered everything, except this. And now he had proof she'd tried to forget. He flipped the photo. A date scribbled in pencil. June 6th. No message. No signature. Just a time. Just the ghost of a memory, left behind in a box no one had mailed. Shaq looked back at the house. It had aged. Sure. But it hadn't fallen. The structure still stood with a kind of reluctant dignity. The way some people carry grief, not openly, but in the way their shoulders never quite relax. The house hadn't been abandoned. It had been contained. Isolated. Covered just enough to disappear from maps, minds, and stories. He tucked the photo back into the envelope and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Then he turned, walking away slowly, but not in retreat. This wasn't over. The house knew something. So did the town. And now, so did he. The past hadn't vanished. It had simply waited until the right eyes came looking again. The morning after the envelope, Shaq wasn't thinking about the house. He was thinking about the boy. The one who shouted. The one who vanished. The one who knew more than he was ever supposed to. He began asking questions. Not loudly, not forcefully, but deliberately. A gentle check at the youth shelter. A quiet word, with a volunteer at the food pantry. A side conversation with Pastor Glenn, who knew every lost kid in Cedar Valley by face, if not by name. None of them had seen a barefoot boy that matched the description. No ridge, no records.
Not recently, not ever.
Shaq widened the circle. He stopped by the after-school program on Hastings Street and walked the edge of the community garden where local teens gathered. He even stood outside the gas station that stayed open too late, the kind of place where the invisible often lingered in the glow of vending machines and bad lighting. Still nothing. No one had seen him. Except one, an elderly woman named Miss Ruth, sitting on her porch with a blanket across her knees and binoculars in her lap. Shaq had almost walked past her when she called out softly, without looking up. "You seen the ghost kid, huh?" He stopped. She tapped the binoculars and tilted her head toward Weller Street. "That boy. Folks say he's not real. I say folks lie when truth gets too strange." Shaq asked her what she meant. She didn't answer directly, just shifted in her chair and added, "He don't speak to everyone, just to people who might listen." That was all she said. Shaq nodded and moved on. Ghost kid. It didn't sound like a name. It sounded like a warning people dressed up as folklore, the kind they pass around just enough to pretend they don't believe it. But Shaq wasn't buying that, because ghosts don't leave footprints, and he had seen them, pressed into dry dirt, leading away from that house. Steps far too small to be his. Faint, but real. He retraced them, back to the alley behind the house on Weller. Narrow, choked with shadows. Trash bins lined like crooked teeth. A rusted bike, missing its chain, lay behind a broken gate. The kind of place that swallowed sound. Shaq crouched low and scanned the ground. That's when he found it. A sock, thin, balled up, wedged beneath the back wheel of an old shopping cart. Not tattered, just worn, like someone had changed and left in a hurry. Nearby, a plastic wristband, the kind given at hospitals. The printed text had faded, but beneath the smudge, a partial name remained. Gee, it wasn't proof. Not yet. But it was something. He took both and stored them carefully in a sealed envelope. He didn't know why. Maybe instinct. Maybe the boy had been trying to leave pieces of himself behind, breadcrumbs for someone willing to follow. Back at home, Shaq placed them next to the photograph of Lucille. The pieces didn't connect yet, but he felt the pulse of a pattern forming. Something broken that had stayed broken too long. That afternoon he visited the library archives. Old newspaper microfilms. Public records. Census sheets with faded names and fading relevance. He didn't expect to find the boy. He was searching for the past the boy might belong to. And in a 23-year-old article about a zoning dispute on Weller Street, buried in a quote from a protester, he found it. "They want to clear the land, push us out, and bury families like the Caldwells without a funeral." Caldwell. Shaq whispered the name aloud. He scanned the article again. No first names. No follow-up stories. No obituaries. Just that single aching mention of a family that vanished with the ink on the paper. He left the library without checking out anything. Just carrying that name in his chest, like a seed he wasn't ready to plant. That evening, he returned to the shortcut. Not to the house. To the place where the boy had first appeared. The lawn was still dry. The porch just as sagged, but the air felt heavier, less like silence, more like someone holding their breath. He waited. 30 minutes passed, then an hour. No boy, no movement. But before he left, he noticed something new. On the fence near where the child had stood was a mark etched into the wood. Small, almost missed. A crude drawing. A triangle, with a dot in the center. A symbol, maybe, or a message. He touched it lightly, fresh, carved not with strength, but desperation. Shaq took one last look around. Nothing moved. Nothing blinked. But everything watched. This wasn't over. Whoever Ridge was, he hadn't vanished. Not really. He had warned him. And now Shaq wasn't just hearing that warning. He was following it. Because people don't disappear without someone helping them stay gone. Shaq didn't tell anyone he was going back. He returned to Weller Street in the late morning, when the sun was highest and shadows shortest. It was the kind of light that was supposed to chase things away. But not everything fears sunlight. Some truths live right inside it. The house stood as it had the day before. Crooked porch, windless chime, paint like shed skin. But today, he brought gloves and a quiet resolve. No cameras, no team, just him and the envelope, still tucked into his jacket pocket. He crossed the yard and climbed the porch. The boards creaked but didn't shift. The air changed again, not colder, just denser, like walking underwater. He reached for the knob, hesitated once, then turned it slowly. The door wasn't locked. It opened with a sigh, the kind only old houses know how to make. Inside, everything stopped. The air smelled faintly of lemon oil and dust, the kind of scent you'd find in a grandmother's house that no one had lived in for years. But someone had kept cleaning anyway. Shaq stepped in, boots sinking slightly into thick aging carpet. The floor didn't groan under his weight. It accepted him, welcomed him. The living room opened wide, flooded in natural light filtered through slatted blinds. Nothing was broken. No graffiti, no sign of squatters. The furniture was vintage but in place. Plastic covers still protected the couch cushions. A clock on the mantel had stopped at not broken, just paused. Everything was preserved.
That was the word. Not abandoned.
Preserved. And that's what made his chest tighten. Shaq moved slowly. Every step felt like stepping into a life paused mid-sentence. A floral armchair near the window. Doilies on the end tables. A tea set matching perfectly arranged. Too perfect. Like someone had left in a hurry and expected to return. Then he saw the wall. Framed photographs. Dozens of them. Lined the hallway. Black families. Weddings. Graduations. Baptisms. Faces smiling. Eyes bright. The kind of wall that told a story of legacy and belonging. Shaq's pace slowed. Some of the faces were familiar. Not from television. Not from his past. From Cedar Valley. From the missing pieces of Cedar Valley. A man who used to run a car shop that closed without warning. A teacher from the elementary school whose classroom had been emptied overnight. A couple whose house went up for auction. No signs, no warnings. Just gone. He stared at each photo, breath held, heart inching toward his throat. He remembered these people. So did the town. Or at least, it used to. Why were they all here? Why were their images frozen in this house like echoes trapped behind glass? He stepped closer to one photo. A woman in her 40s, head tilted, laughter caught mid-moment. Shaq remembered her laugh. She used to sit 3 rows behind him at church, humming off-key. Her name had been Gloria. She disappeared in '97. No funeral, just stopped coming. Some said she moved. Others said nothing. Her photo was dated. Shaq moved farther down the hall, and the frames continued. Some were newer, some older, but all black, all from Cedar Valley, all gone without explanation. This wasn't just a wall, it was a ledger, a history hidden in plain sight. And then, there was Lucille. Near the end of the hallway, in a black and silver frame, her photo stared back at him. Not young, not old, somewhere in between, standing in front of this very house, holding a basket of laundry, and smiling like she owned the sun. His hands trembled slightly. She never spoke of this house, never hinted at this place. Yet here she was, rooted into its memory like a chapter torn from his life and pasted into a stranger's book. He stepped back, struggling to make sense of it. The house didn't feel haunted in the traditional sense. There were no whispers, no shadows, just presence. A presence so strong it pushed the breath from his lungs. In the dining room, the table was set for 4. Plates spotless. Napkins folded into swans. Above it hung a painting of Cedar Valley's old downtown, back when black businesses lined Main Street. Before redevelopment. Before rezoning. Before the polite forgetfulness crept in. This house wasn't just remembering. It was refusing to forget. Shaq moved into the kitchen. The counters were clean. A calendar from 2001 still hung beside the fridge, frozen on the month of June. One date was circled in red. June. The same date from the back of the photo he found in the envelope. Something happened that day. Something no one talked about. Something this house had never let go. He felt the chill finally. Not from fear but from knowing. Knowing that this place was not haunted by spirits. It was haunted by erasure. By a history the town had buried. But this house kept the names, the pictures, the stories. And now it had called him. Shaq didn't take anything. He didn't open drawers. He didn't touch the clock. He just stood in that space, heart full of questions and a rising fury that sat low in his chest. Not the kind that burned, the kind that built, because now it was personal. And it had only just begun. The next time Shaq entered the house, he wasn't wandering, he was searching. Not for ghosts, not for memories, for truth. Tangible, name-bound, time-stamped truth. He came with gloves and a flashlight, a thick notepad, and an envelope to store anything fragile. The smell of the house hadn't changed. Lemon oil, dust, preservation. But now the stillness felt like it was holding its breath for him. He moved toward the hallway wall, the photo wall, and stared at Lucille's image one more time. She didn't blink. She didn't speak. But standing there, Shaq felt something unspoken pass between them. An understanding. A nudge. He stepped into the back room. It was smaller than the others. Plain. No decorations. No furniture. Just a single dusty rug in the center of the hardwood floor. At first glance it was nothing. But something about that rug bothered him. It wasn't centered. He pulled it back. Underneath, 3 floorboards had been tampered with. Not pried up forcefully. Not broken, loosened. Like they were meant to be opened but hidden again. Shaq crouched and worked his fingers along the edges. One board lifted with a dry creak, then another. Beneath them lay a long, shallow cavity lined with black cloth. And inside, a ledger. He stared at it before touching it. Thick, leather-bound, worn by time, but carefully preserved. He lifted it with both hands. It felt heavier than paper should, not just in weight, but in meaning. Shaq sat cross-legged on the floor, dust swirling around his shoes, and opened the cover. The first page was dated. The heading scrawled in pen, "Personal records, internal." It looked like property documentation, until he flipped further. Each entry listed a family. Last name, number of residence, address. A column for action taken, another for date cleared. Some said evicted. Some said transfer. Some said nothing at all. Just red X's. Shaq's fingers moved slowly, turning page after page. Dozens of names, then hundreds. Almost all of them black. Families he remembered. Some he had only heard stories about. Names that had been missing from school records, church directories, property rolls. Not because they moved, because someone moved them out. His hand stilled on one page. Caldwell Ridge. Age 9. Guardian. Naomi Caldwell. Address 27 Weller Street. Status family removed. Guardian held for process. Held for process. There was no arrest record. No trial. No story ever told about a Caldwell family taken from their home. But here it was. Neatly typed. Underlined. Ridge's name circled once in red pen. Shaq swallowed. That little boy, the barefoot child who warned him, wasn't just a ghost in folklore. He was real. He had lived here. His family had lived here. Until they didn't. Flipping forward, Shaq began to notice patterns. Some names had the same signature beside them. A spidery looping M. Whitlow. Again and again. Margaret Whitlow, a name that up to now had only belonged to garden parties, and thin smiles behind tinted sunglasses. But here, in this ledger, she was something else entirely. Not just a neighbor. An architect. Of silence. Of removal. The truth wasn't hidden in shadows. It was filed away. Shaq set the book down for a moment, leaning back, spine against the wall. The air in the room felt heavier now. Or maybe it was just the weight inside his chest. He thought of Ridge. Of his silence. His fear. His disappearance. Shaq wondered how many others had tried to remember but were forced to forget. Or punished for trying. He reopened the ledger, and kept going. Some names were crossed out twice. Some had notes next to them. Resistant. Spoke to press. Non-compliant. As if being black and uncooperative was a punishable offense. It wasn't just property theft. It was identity erasure. A systematic undoing of presence. Shaq closed the book carefully. He took out his notepad and copied down key entries. Names, dates, especially anything tied to Ridge and the Caldwell family. He documented every page signed M. Whitlow, every house listed on Weller and the surrounding streets. He didn't take the ledger. Not yet. It belonged here, at least for now. As a witness, he replaced the floorboards carefully, laid the rug back as it had been, and stood up. The house seemed to exhale with him, not in relief, but recognition.
Like it had waited years for someone to find the evidence, not to fix the past.
To expose it. On his way out, Shaq glanced back at the living room. The light had shifted. Slanted shadows now sliced through the blinds, casting thin stripes across the photo wall, like prison bars. He stared at Lucille's picture one more time. She had been part of this neighborhood once, and now, through him, she was part of its reckoning. The door closed behind him without a sound, but the silence that followed, it wasn't quiet, it was loaded. Because now Shaq wasn't just walking with questions. He was carrying names. Shaq came back to the house on a day when the skies looked too clean, too clear, the kind of day that lied about what the world had buried. He brought nothing with him this time. No flashlight, no gloves. Just a deep breath, and a mind sharpened by what he had already seen. The ledger had lit a fire beneath everything. But fire alone didn't expose truth. The kind he was after lived in corners, in dust, in objects people forget to erase. The house didn't creak when he walked in anymore. It didn't need to announce itself. By now, it had accepted him the way a locked box accepts the key. This time, he didn't stop at the hallway of photos. He went deeper. The dining room held more than fine dishes and fake normalcy. Tucked in the drawers of the sideboard were unsent letters, half-folded, yellowed at the edges. Some typed, some handwritten, all written by hands desperate to be heard. Most started with "to whom it may concern." A few were addressed to city officials, others to journalists, some with names scratched out. All of them told the same story in different words. "We are being pushed out. We are not safe. Please come before it's too late." None had stamps. None were mailed. He laid them gently across the table. It looked like a dinner service of forgotten truth. The ink had faded, but the pain hadn't. Words bled off the paper in small, tight handwriting that got sloppier as the letters went on, like the writers had run out of time or hope. Then he entered the smallest room in the house. It was square, barely wide enough to stretch both arms. A twin bed still stood against one wall, a faded red blanket folded on top. On the opposite side was a desk, plain wood, peeling varnish, with a drawer left half open. Inside it, he found a collection of photos, black and white. Each had a single subject, black men and boys, lined up outside homes, hands behind their backs. Police stood in each frame, not brutalizing, just standing, posed, almost proud. The back of each photo had a date. One had a red stamp across the bottom, compliance achieved. Shaq sat on the bed, feeling the floor groan beneath him, and stared at the images. There was no blood in them, no bruises, just the cold documentation of submission. He turned his eyes to the wooden floor beneath his boots. It was uneven. He stood and pushed the bed aside. The floor beneath bore thick scratches. Not random, not clawed, purposeful drag marks. Long and arched, like something heavy had been pulled over it again and again. He placed his palm flat on the floor. The wood was colder here. This room hadn't been used, just for sleep. It had witnessed removals, forced ones. He stepped into the hallway and turned toward the back of the house. There, a door led to what looked like a storage closet, but the knob had been replaced recently. New brass. Still shiny. The only part of the house that gleamed. Shaq turned it. Inside, the walls were lined with boxes, each labeled in pen, WS case files. Stacks of documents, photos, photocopies of IDs, property transfers, signatures. Everything legal, everything deliberate. He opened the first box. Eviction notices. Some signed, some not. Most dated in the same 2-year span, 1995 to 1997. He recognized addresses, 13 properties, all black-owned, all transferred to shell companies, all later listed as redeveloped. At the bottom of the box, a stamped letterhead caught his eye. Whitlow and Associates, Property Conversion Advisory. The name again, Margaret Whitlow, a neighbor in daylight, an architect in the dark. This house hadn't just seen the fallout. It had processed it, filed it, stored it. Shaq closed the box and stepped back. The house wasn't haunted. It was aware. Like a mind that had watched injustice repeat itself for decades, and finally, had someone willing to listen. He moved back into the living room and looked at the floor again. At first glance it looked ordinary, but in the right light thin scuffs in the carpet formed a repeating pattern, almost circular, almost frantic, like a chair had once been dragged across the same spot, back and forth, over and over. Someone pacing, someone trapped, someone losing time in motion. Shaq stood in that spot, silent. He could feel it now. Not just the weight of the air, The memory of it. Every room had seen something. Every wall had heard names spoken once, then never again. And here he was, standing in the middle of it, not just as a witness, but as a reader of its language. This house didn't scream.
It documented.
Quietly, precisely, permanently. And now, so would he. It was the third time Shaq had returned to the house that week, and the first time he wasn't alone. The sun had barely settled into its afternoon place when he reached the porch, but something was already waiting. Or someone. As he crossed the yard, he saw him barefoot again, same wild-eyed stillness, crouched near the side of the porch with one knee in the dirt like a sentry, who never left his post. Ridge. This time the boy didn't run, didn't shout. He just watched Shaq approach with the stillness of someone too young to be that quiet, unless they'd seen too much. Shaq stopped 3 paces away. The boy looked smaller up close. But his eyes weren't soft. They carried a storm held back by sheer will. Shaq spoke low. Even. This house, it was yours. Ridge didn't answer at first, but his stare was a confession. Then a single nod. Shaq sat down on the porch steps beside him. Knees wide, elbows on his thighs. No questions. Just space. Just time. Finally Ridge broke the silence. My mom used to cook in that kitchen every Sunday, he said, voice gravel soft. Cornbread, collard greens, peach cobbler, said it made the house remember us. Shaq turned toward him. It still does. Ridge didn't smile. He just picked at the edge of his shirt sleeve. They said we were dangerous. Said my uncle had drugs in the attic. That's what they used. The reason, but there was nothing. They brought police anyway. We were gone in 3 days. The words came in pieces, but each one hit like a nail driven into wet wood. Mom tried to fight it. Filed papers. Called people. One night they took her in. Said she was resisting. She never came back. Shaq's jaw tightened. Ridge's fingers trembled, but he didn't wipe the tears forming. He wasn't ashamed of them. He wore them like proof. I came back 6 months later. Lived in the alley at first. Waited for someone to ask why the house never got sold. Why no one moved in. But they never did. Just kept trimming the lawn and acting like it was nothing. Because it's easier to bury what you're scared to face. Shaq murmured. Ridge nodded, pulling a folded page from his pocket. It was torn, creased at every angle, like it had been read 1,000 times. He handed it to Shaq. It was a property transfer slip. The name on the deed scratched out and rewritten. Ridge's address. A forged signature at the bottom. The paper dated just 2 weeks after the eviction. In the bottom right corner was a printed name, M. Whitlow. Shaq didn't need more proof. But this made it personal in a new way. They tried to burn it once, Ridge said quietly. Last fall, I saw the gas can behind the fence. Someone cut the line to the porch light and poured it through the floor vents. Shaq turned sharply. Did you see who? Ridge shook his head. They came when I was out. But I think they saw me after. Because they started watching me. His voice lowered. And now they know I told. A gust of wind moved through the grass. It wasn't loud, but it carried weight. Both of them knew what he meant. Not just being followed. Not just intimidation. Erasure. The same thing that happened to his mother. To every photo on that hallway wall. Shaq looked out across the street. No one stood in windows. But curtains had moved. The watchers were subtle. They had always been. Why stay? He asked. Why keep coming back? Ridge didn't even blink. Because this is the last thing they don't own. They think if no one remembers, it never happened. But the house remembers. I just help it speak. Shaq stared at him. A kid who had lost everything but somehow stayed rooted. Not because he was strong, but because no one else had come to finish what the house started. Telling the truth. You're not alone anymore, Shaq said. Ridge looked up at him, cautious. They think silence protects them, Shaq continued. But what if it turns into sound? The boy tilted his head slightly, unsure. Shaq reached into his coat pocket, pulled out the envelope that had started everything, the one with Lucille's photo, and laid it gently between them. My mother lived here. She never told me, but she left me something to find. Something she didn't want to disappear. Ridge looked at the photo, then at Shaq. His breathing steadied. You're gonna tell it, aren't you? The boy asked. Not hopeful, just direct. Shaq nodded. Not just me. You too. But not like this. Not in hiding. Out loud. Ridge folded his arms across his knees. He wasn't ready to agree. Not yet. But he didn't run. And for someone like Ridge, staying was the first sign of trust. As they sat in silence again, a low hum buzzed through the air, not from the street, but from inside the house. A vibration, almost mechanical. Shaq turned sharply. He stood, entered the house again, and followed the hum. It was coming from the back room, the closet full of files. A small fan had kicked on inside, triggered by heat, automatic, old, forgotten. But attached to it, on the side wall, was something he hadn't seen before. A red sticker, half peeled, marked active monitor, zone. There had been surveillance. Maybe still was. Someone wasn't just watching from the outside. They had once watched from within. Shaq returned to the porch, heart thudding harder than before. Ridge looked up with a knowing expression. You feel it too? The boy asked. Shaq nodded. The history wasn't sleeping anymore. And the people who buried it, they'd notice. Shaq didn't come back to the house the next day. He needed time, not to rest, but to think, to let the pieces breathe. But when he did return, he brought clarity with him. Not as armor, but as a blade, the kind used to cut through the veil of polite lies. The door welcomed him again, no resistance. The floor beneath his boots felt less like wood now, and more like history hardened beneath the weight of footsteps never accounted for. Ridge hadn't been seen since their last conversation. Shaq assumed that was intentional. The boy had survived by staying invisible. Now, it was Shaq's turn to make the truth unavoidable. He went straight to the study, the room that once appeared empty, but now buzzed with withheld stories. Behind the small desk, beneath a loose panel on the inside of the built-in shelf, he found a hidden drawer. Shallow but wide. Not locked, just hidden well enough that someone would have to want to find it. He slid it open. Inside lay 6 worn ledgers, leather covers cracked at the spines. Not labeled on the outside. Inside they bled. Donations, property transfers, transactions dressed up as kindness. But it was all fiction. Names of local black families were scrawled beside dollar signs. Relocation assistance, the entries claimed. But every amount matched a property later seized through blight ordinances or non-compliance fees. It wasn't charity. It was camouflage. The second ledger detailed payments. Not to families, to officials. Code enforcement officers, local judges, even a school board member. Handwritten notes followed many of the entries. Ensure filing disappears. Redirect zoning request. Silence community board opposition. Each payment signed with the same letters, in the same cursive slant. M.W. Shaq didn't need a full name to know who it belonged to. Margaret Whitlow, Cedar Valley's smiling hostess. The woman who served lemon cake at fundraisers and called the cops when neighborhood kids played music too loud. The same one who'd driven her SUV into his mother's mailbox 3 times in the same month, and never once said a word. Her kindness had always been sugared over arsenic. She wasn't just a neighbor. She was the architect of silence. The third ledger was the most damning. It detailed events, labeled operations in casual handwriting. Each event targeted a household. A plan of approach. Contacts listed. Outcomes tracked. One rid. Caldwell. Observed non-compliance. Public narrative. Suspected narcotics. Final result. Removal. No press coverage. Shaq's stomach turned. Another. Lawrence Pastor. Outreach interference. Redirect city permit. Initiate blight process on adjacent property. Result, relocation. Congregation dissolve. Each entry was dated. Every outcome measured. It was surgical. Deliberate. And at the bottom of one page, a chilling line circled in red ink. They won't scream if you whisper. The words hit Shaq like a punch to the chest. Not because they were loud, but because they were true for Cedar Valley. No one had screamed. Not loudly. Not for long. Margaret hadn't just built the system, she had refined it. She didn't erase people by force. She erased them through bureaucracy, through checkbooks, through redevelopment and progress. The mailbox wasn't a random act. It was a message. A reminder that she still believed she held the pen. That names like Lucille, names like Ridge, belonged to footnotes in her version of history. But now her handwriting had betrayed her. Shaq took photos of every page. He scanned the entries, documented dates, signatures, cross-referenced them with names from the hallway wall. Every photograph, every eviction, every false charge, it all flowed back to this drawer, this woman, this house. And suddenly, the layout made sense. This place hadn't just remembered history. It had recorded it. She had used it as her operations center, her quiet war room. The house wasn't haunted by tragedy. It was soaked in evidence. As he replaced the ledgers carefully, a final piece slid loose from beneath the last one. A smaller file, tucked inside, a photo. Shaq froze. It was a picture of Lucille, older than the one he'd found in the envelope. This time, she wasn't smiling. Her face was set, standing in front of a protest sign. Beside her, a younger Margaret Whitlow. Their expressions couldn't have been more different. Lucille resolved. Margaret, composed, but triumphant. They had known each other, fought each other. This wasn't a mystery to Margaret. This was a victory, one she thought would stay buried forever. Shaq held the photo longer than he meant to. Long enough to remember his mother's voice on late summer nights, when she'd warn him, "Some folks don't burn crosses anymore. They burn records and they smile while they're doing it." She wasn't speaking metaphorically. She was speaking about Margaret. He slid the photo into his pocket. The house was no longer just memory. It was evident. Every room, every drawer, every scratch on the floorboards. It all built toward one undeniable conclusion. Cedar Valley hadn't forgotten its past. It had just outsourced its silence to people like Margaret Whitlow. But silence ends when you finally listen. Shaq stepped back into the sunlight, ledgers recorded, story in hand. It wasn't just time to confront Margaret. It was time to confront the town that let her write their history in disappearing ink. Shaq arrived just before sundown. He had told no one he was going back. Not Ridge, not Monmera, not even the pastor he'd started confiding in. The town was quiet that evening. Too quiet for a place that usually hummed with the gentle throb of weekend prep. There were no leaf blowers, no distant dogs, just the steady creak of his truck door closing, and the whisper of wind that felt too carefully placed. The house on Weller Street stood like it always did, bent, breathing, but strangely alert. It had been a day since he uncovered the drawer, the ledgers, the signatures, the face of a woman who built silence one signature at a time, and now, knowing all of that, the house didn't feel like it was holding secrets. It felt like it was under threat. He came to board the doors, not to hide the house, but to protect it. He didn't know from whom yet. But the fire Ridge had spoken about wasn't a metaphor, and after what he'd found, Shaq knew something would come for it. He climbed the steps with wood planks tucked under one arm and a crowbar in the other. But before he could knock on the door out of habit, he noticed something wrong. The handle wasn't cold, it was warm. And worse, it turned without resistance. The front door was unlocked. He hesitated only for a breath, then pushed it open. The smell hit him first. Smoke, low and recent, laced with wax and something metallic. The living room wasn't empty like he'd left it. Candles sat in corners, melted down just enough to prove they hadn't been lit long ago. The flame from one still danced weakly near the mantel, flickering against shadows that stretched unnaturally across the old walls. Shaq stepped in cautiously. Every muscle coiled. The floor creaked beneath his boots. Someone had been here. Maybe still was. He scanned the room. Furniture untouched. Photos still on the wall. The ledger closet still closed. But near the fireplace, something new. Ashes. And not old ones. A photo, still half intact, lay on the floorboards, curled at the edges. Its corners blackened. Lucille, same photo as before. The one he'd found in the hidden file, standing tall in front of that protest sign. But now her face was seared away, replaced by a jagged hole of The burn wasn't an accident. It was surgical. Someone had come here to erase her again. Shaq crouched and picked up what was left. The paper crumbled slightly in his fingers. But the message was clear. Whoever had been here knew what he'd found, knew Lucille's face, and wanted it gone. But not completely.
They could have burned the whole house.
They didn't. This wasn't just fear. It was taunting. He moved to the hallway, heart thudding. The photo wall remained, every face staring back at him, like sentinels of stolen time. He reached out and touched the frame of Gloria's portrait, the teacher who vanished in '97, half expecting it to be cracked, stolen, gone. It wasn't. Whatever had come through here hadn't touched the wall. Only Lucille. Only her. He stepped deeper into the house, toward the back. The door to the record room was open. He hadn't left it that way. He flicked the light switch. Nothing. Power had been cut, not by the city, but by hand. The meter box had been tampered with. He could tell by the way the candles had been arranged, not scattered, not accidental. Someone knew how to move in the dark here. Inside the record closet, the files were untouched. But on the floor sat a single red envelope. No name, no seal, just the color, too deliberate. Shaq picked it up and opened it slowly. Inside, a Polaroid, fresh, of him standing on this very porch 2 days ago, holding the ledger. The photo had been taken from across the street, behind a screen or curtain. He'd been watched, documented, like the people in those old photos. Only now he wasn't the observer. He was the subject. His breath tightened. Not from panic, from clarity. Whoever had built this system hadn't stopped. They hadn't retreated when the ledgers surfaced. They'd adjusted, shifted, and now they were reclaiming the story, before it could be told. He backed out of the room, nerves alight. At the end of the hall, he noticed something else, fresh scuff marks on the floor. Not big ones, just faint lines curving around the living room's edge. They led toward the kitchen. He followed them. No one there. Just an open window. The curtain danced in the evening air. He closed it gently. Secured the lock, moved from window to window, room to room, sealing everything. He nailed the front door shut from the inside, then slipped out through the back and latched it from the outside as best he could. He circled the house once, slowly, nothing. But that silence he'd known before, it was gone, replaced by something worse than noise.
Awareness.
The house wasn't just telling its story anymore. It had become the battlefield. Lucille had stood in front of this house once, defiant, unshaken. Margaret had smiled beside her, already planning the quiet erasure that would follow. And now, decades later, someone had come back to finish what Margaret started. But they made one mistake. They didn't erase everything. Because the wall still stood. The ledgers still waited. Ridge still knew. And Shaq, now more than ever, understood what was at stake. History wasn't buried in Cedar Valley. It was hunted. But it remembered who tried to erase it. And now, so would everyone else. Shaq stood beneath the stale lights of Cedar Valley's municipal records office, eyes scanning documents that hadn't seen daylight in years. Rows of file cabinets lined the walls, each drawer labeled by year, by district, by lot. The air smelled like bureaucracy and faint mold, a scent that only lingered in places where stories were stripped of emotion and reduced to permits, citations, and approval. He hadn't expected to find anything at first. Not here. Not in a place so clean and sterile. But what he uncovered wasn't a cover-up. It was worse. It was consent. Email chains between zoning boards and property advisory councils stretched back nearly 3 decades. Some were short, polite. One thread stood out, a back and forth between Margaret Whitlow and a town planner about streamlining the revitalization process. Margaret had written, "It's important these transitions happen without unnecessary attention. There's a way to guide this that won't spark outrage." The reply? Just a thumbs up emoji, scanned into the printed PDF, followed by a signed approval. Shaq read deeper. Noise complaints. Dozens of them. Filed against families whose only crime was hosting reunions or barbecues. Reports from neighborhood associations that certain elements were affecting property values. Some of the language was coded. Most wasn't. The Smith residence is frequently visited by unfamiliar cars. Loud conversations on the porch after 9 p.m. The Delaney house has too many teens walking to and from. Possible unsupervised minors. Too many lawn chairs outside the Owens home. Looks messy. Each complaint triggered citations. Citations led to fines. Fines turned to lane. And then, a new owner. Shaq flipped through city council minutes. Meetings where policies were passed under the guise of beautification and community growth. In one meeting from 2004, a resolution passed without debate that designated 3 majority black streets as redevelopment priority zones.
No protest.
No objections. Unanimous vote. He pulled up the list of council members from that year. Names he still saw at fundraisers, in church pews, on the plaques outside local schools. It wasn't that they hadn't known what Margaret was doing. They knew. They agreed with her. Silently. Softly. They nodded when she spoke. Smiled when she pitched improvements. Applauded her when she cut ribbons at park openings. Parks built where families used to live. No burning crosses. No mobs. Just unchecked politeness. Shaq found one final document. A scanned copy of a community board newsletter from 1998. Margaret had written the opening letter. Progress happens best when we all move in quiet step. Cedar Valley is a town of values, and those values are rooted in peace, order, and shared vision. It sounded harmless. But he heard the sharp edge under the surface. Peace, in her world, meant silence. Order meant conformity. And shared vision meant agreeing not to see certain people at all. He gathered copies of the permits, the zoning adjustments, the complaints, the minutes, all stamped, all legal, none of them overtly criminal. And that's what made it insidious. It wasn't that the town turned a blind eye, it's that they lent a hand. Every ordinance that moved a line on a map, every form that said non-compliant, every neighbor who said, well, they weren't taking care of the place anyway. It built a machine that didn't scream. It whispered, and its whisper sounded like civic duty. When Shaq walked out of that office, a thin file folder tucked beneath his arm, the sky had turned pale blue and still, but nothing felt still inside him. Because now he didn't just know what Margaret had done. He knew how many people let her. The first fire came in the dead of night. Quiet, calculated, and meant to leave no witnesses. Shaq got the call from Ridge before dawn, the boy's voice tight with urgency but never panic. Ridge had been watching again, sleeping nearby in shifts, waiting for the thing he said would come. And it did. By the time Shaq arrived, smoke still curled from the baseboards, blackened along the porch railings. Someone had doused the entryway in accelerant and set flame to the front. But the fire hadn't spread far. A neighbor called it in anonymously, a rare act in a street where silence had always paid better than involvement. Firefighters arrived quickly. Too quickly. Like they'd been ready. Suspiciously ready. But when pressed, no one asked questions. They hosed it down, gave a vague report of possible electrical fault, then cleared out with the efficiency of people who wanted no part of what this place held. Shaq stood on the porch, boards soaked and scorched, looking down at the one spot that had taken the worst of it. The place where Lucille's photo had been laid weeks ago. It was gone now, but something deeper lingered. The second fire came 3 days later. A back window shattered. A Molotov tossed and fizzled before it reached the hallway wall. Ridge had been there again, fast with a bucket, even faster with his phone. This time Shaq arrived before the fire had a chance to think. That was the turning point. They stopped waiting for help that wasn't coming. They began the rebuild themselves. Not to restore it to what it had been, a forgotten monument to theft and silence, but to transform it into something that couldn't be ignored anymore. They started by reinforcing the porch. Ridge hammered the new planks with the kind of focused rhythm only someone who'd had everything taken could maintain. Shaq laid insulation by hand, replacing warped drywall with care, like the walls were bones of something still sacred. And then they gave it a name. The Memory House. Not a museum, not a shrine, a living archive, a place where the stories that were nearly erased could root and grow. They didn't announce it. Word spread on its own. It started with a knock. A woman Shaq barely recognized from the church choir. She held a plastic grocery bag and asked if she could leave a photo. Her father, taken by city officers in 1986 and never seen again. She placed it near the mantel and left without asking for thanks. Then a man arrived. Mid-60s, eyes sharp beneath years of held-back truths. He brought a newspaper clipping and a church bulletin. Said he'd been told to forget what happened on Croswell Avenue in 19... I remember now, he said. By the end of the week, a dozen names had passed through. Some whispered, some cried, some left documents, handwritten notes, eviction letters, even cassette tapes with interviews recorded in secret. The house filled with truth. Each room claimed a purpose. One for lost families, one for false charges. One room became Lucille's room, filled with the letters Shaq had once found in her handwriting, framed and placed gently along the walls like guiding stars. Ridge curated the hallway, his hallway carefully arranging the old photos alongside new ones as more people came forward with the faces of the erased. The town tried to look away again, but something had shifted. The memory house didn't just stand, it called. And the call grew louder with every story added. Shaq filed a petition to place it under community historic protection. The city council dragged their feet at first, until media interest crept in. A local blogger wrote a piece. Then a regional podcast picked it up. The town that buried its own began trending. Pressure worked where truth hadn't. Eventually the house was granted protected status. They couldn't burn it again. Not legally. Not without someone asking why. But fire wasn't the only threat. Margaret Whitlow remained silent. But her absence was louder now. Her name came up in murmurs, then in files, then in voices too tired of staying quiet. A local teacher came forward. Said Margaret once warned her not to agitate parents by assigning books about redlining. A former zoning clerk admitted under anonymous interview that Margaret's office had offered placement bonuses, legal bribes disguised as grants.
But the real evidence was in the house itself.
Laid bare. Every week, more people showed up. Some came in shame, some came in rage. But they came, and slowly, painfully. Cedar Valley began to see itself, not as a town with a dark past, but as a town that chose not to see. A town where racism wore a name tag and served at bake sales. Where bigotry didn't yell. It signed permits. But now, the house remembered everything. And forgetting it wasn't possible anymore. As Shaq stood one evening at the top of the new porch, watching Ridge carefully hang a framed petition signed by over 400 locals now supporting the house's mission, he felt it. Not peace, not yet, but pressure released. The kind that only comes when the weight of unspoken history is finally allowed to exhale. They had tried to burn it down, but the house had held, because truth doesn't burn, it just waits. The day was bright again, like the first one. Georgia's sun poured through the wide sky without apology, casting long shadows across Cedar Valley like it always had. But now, the shadows didn't feel like something to avoid. They felt like memory. Shaq stood at the foot of the new steps, Ridge beside him. The house behind them had a fresh coat of paint, not to hide age, but to preserve it. Nothing was made to look perfect. The cracks in the porch rails, the scorched brickwork near the base, even the scuffed door handle were left intact. They were reminders. The past had happened here, and it wouldn't be hidden again. The memory house breathed around them now, not in silence, but in whispers. Voices from visitors reading captions beneath the hallway portraits. From a tour guide leading a group of high school students through the policy room. From an elder in the back who had just discovered his own father's name in the housing ledger registry. The living spoke for the dead now, and every story told made the walls stronger. Shaq walked through the house slowly, his footsteps careful on the wood. Ridge followed, holding a small clipboard, taking notes. He was in charge of archiving now, something he'd started doing quietly, and now carried with practiced command. They reached the main hallway. Every photo had been labeled now. No more nameless faces. No more silent frames. Gloria Thomas, teacher. Forced to resign. Jonas Caldwell, Ridge's uncle. Arrested without charge. Lucille O'Neill, community voice. Silenced but never erased. Each image bore a single line beneath it. You didn't forget us. They tried to make you. The hallway ended at a mirror. Placed deliberately, it had no caption. But visitors always paused at it. Looked into their own reflections after walking through the history. Some cried. Some grew angry. Some simply stared. Shaq moved into the kitchen next. The counters were new, but the burn mark in the corner of the window frame remained. He'd insisted it stay. That scar is proof, he'd told Ridge. Proof someone tried, and failed. They moved toward Lucille's room. Shaq touched the frame as he passed through the threshold, like knocking on memory before entering. Her letters lined the walls in glass cases. Handwritten loops and firm punctuation. Her voice preserved on printed pages, speaking of courage, of patience, of justice earned without vengeance. One case held her old church fan. Next to it, a placard. She knew racism wasn't always loud, so she chose to be louder, with kindness. Ridge stood quietly by the doorway, hands in his pockets. I still think she knew this would happen one day, he said. Shaq nodded slowly. She did. That's why she left the picture. She just didn't expect me to wait so long to find it. Ridge looked out the window, toward the street. A small group had gathered by the front lawn, a man in a police uniform, a city archivist, a woman holding a notebook and a camera. More people coming every week, Ridge said. They're listening now. Some of them, Shaq replied. The rest still walk by without looking. But we don't need all of them. Just enough to remember. They moved into the back office. It had become a war room of truth. The ledgers were now behind glass, cataloged and verified by historians who couldn't believe how much had survived. The emails, the permits, the files, all scanned and stored, digital and analog, so it couldn't vanish again. In the corner sat a TV screen looping short interviews, Ridge's voice among them. Shaky at first, but clear now. When you grow up watching people disappear, you learn to hold stories like breath, he said on the recording. This house gave us air again. Outside the sun was beginning to dip. Shaq and Ridge stepped onto the front porch, looking out over the crowd. A small girl in a red hoodie pointed at the house and tugged her mom's sleeve. Her mother leaned in close, reading the new sign beside the steps. You tried to erase us. We remembered instead. Shaq exhaled slowly. He wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't satisfied either. He was aware. Behind them stood the evidence. Ahead of them, a town still learning what it meant to live with uncovered truth. And below their feet, a foundation that had survived fire, time, and silence. Ridge nudged him with his elbow. So, you gonna change the name? Shaq raised a brow. From what to what? From the memory house, Ridge said, to Lucille's house. Shaq smiled. Slow, warm, deep. The kind of smile that held grief, pride, and peace, all at once. Maybe. When the town's ready to say her name, without flinching. They stood there in silence as visitors passed by, some thanking them, some saying nothing. But all seeing. No one looked away anymore. Not completely. And that was the difference. Shaq knew there were other houses, other streets, other towns with foundations full of unspoken stories. But this one, this house had told its truth. It had warned, it had endured, and now, it had taught. And as the last golden light of day slipped behind the rooftops, Shaq looked once more at the plaque nailed beside the doorframe. A simple line, carved into the wood. Don't go in that house, unless you're ready. Because now the house didn't ask for silence. It asked for courage, and those who entered had to be ready to hear what history really sounds like when it finally speaks. This isn't just a story, it's a reckoning. If this house made you feel, imagine the streets still holding their silence. Share the names. Dig into your own town's shadows. Because some truths don't die, they just wait for the right eyes. And now, those eyes might be yours.